You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
And I think until we understand the root cause of the issue and also define what is the issue we're trying to address, we're not going to really be able to do a good job of crafting a solution.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, the CyberWire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host, Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
Today, Ben looks at the Justice Department's attempts to combat ransomware. I've got the story of pending legislation targeting social media algorithms. And later in the show, my conversation with Jenny Lee from Arendt Fox LLP to discuss the recent Facebook whistleblower testimony. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. Now, a word from our sponsor, the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute, currently seeking qualified applicants for its innovative Master of Science in Security Informatics degree program. Study alongside world-class interdisciplinary experts and gain unparalleled educational, research, and professional experience in information security and assurance. Interested U.S. citizens should consider the National Science Foundation's CyberCore Scholarship for Service program, which covers tuition and a $6,000 annual professional development allowance, as well as providing a $37,000 additional annual stipend. Apply for the scholarship and the fall semester by March 1st. Learn more at cs.jhu.edu/MSSI. And now, a word from our sponsor, SpyCloud, the cybercrime analytics leader. SpyCloud disrupts cybercrime by telling you what criminals know about your business and your customers, so you can take action to prevent ransomware, session hijacking, account takeover, and online fraud. SpyCloud constantly recaptures and analyzes new data from the criminal underground, including credentials, session cookies, and PII siphoned from malware-infected devices. With knowledge of the specific exposed data criminals have in hand from InfoStealer malware on managed and unmanaged devices, security teams can respond with a more efficient and effective process called post-infection remediation that fits seamlessly into existing incident response frameworks. Get SpyCloud's post-infection remediation guide outlining the 7 steps for preventing a malware infection from becoming a full-blown ransomware incident. Visit spycloud.com/cyberwire. That's spycloud.com/cyberwire. And we thank SpyCloud for sponsoring our show. All right, Ben, let's jump into some stories here. Why don't you start things off for us?
So we have big news coming from the Department of Justice by way of the New York Times. In an article posted by Katie Benner and Nicole Perlroth at the New York Times, we find out that the Justice Department filed charges against 2 alleged perpetrators of ransomware attacks. So one of them is against a Russian individual named Yevgeny Polyanin, who is accused of deploying the ransomware known as Revil, or Revil.
R-Evil, we say.
R-Evil, we say. Okay.
but that doesn't mean it's correct.
Yeah.
So everyone has their own version.
It's kind of like GIF or GIF.
Yes.
Yeah. It's about your personality,
right.
Which one you use.
Right. It's a Rorschach test.
So this was for a ransomware attack that took place in largely in businesses and government institutions in Texas in 2019. And then the second indictment was against a Ukrainian national, Yaroslav Vasinsky, who is alleged to have conducted multiple ransomware attacks, including the one on the technology company Kaseya. That one I know particularly well because Kaseya runs the software for a contractor that works closely with a small city in Maryland called Leonardtown. And because of that ransomware attack, the small city of Leonardtown suffered significant kinetic effects, cost a lot of money to rebuild their system.
Oh, wow.
And that was just one, tiny example of the impacts of that ransomware attack. So these are 2, pretty high-profile indictments and a sign that the Justice Department is taking ransomware seriously. They're doing everything they can to try and discourage perpetrators around the globe from participating in these types of ransomware attacks.
Okay.
Here's the drawback, though. The question is, how do we actually get to these people and punish them?
Right.
A major issue is that one of these perpetrators is a Russian national. Let's just say a pretty large percentage of people known to have perpetrated ransomware attacks are Russian nationals.
Yep.
And unfortunately for us, we don't have a working extradition treaty with Russia. I was doing a little half-ass internet research, as we say, on this subject. There was actually a U.S.-Russian extradition treaty signed in 1893 with Tsarist Russia. But then at some point in the 1970s, through a Justice Department memo, this was mid-Cold War, it seems like we decided that extradition treaty wasn't actually in place. And we know that now because we've had these high-profile instances of people who have been charged with crimes in the United States hiding out in Russia. The most notorious example being Edward Snowden, but then also, some of the people who were charged as part of the Mueller investigation for misinformation against U.S. nationals. So that's a significant problem. It's hard for us to gain jurisdiction and bring these cyber criminals to justice. For this Ukrainian guy, luckily for us, he set foot in Poland. We do have an extradition treaty with Poland. So he was arrested there. He's going to be extradited to the United States and will face trial in our U.S. court system. But the problem with a lot of these other perpetrators is, we may have all the evidence in the world to charge them. I'm sure we could put together a really compelling trial, talk about the impact of ransomware on, our local governments, on our businesses, on the meatpacking industry. I'm sure we could put together a very good case, but it's very difficult to bring these alleged criminals under our jurisdiction.
Yeah, and it seems as though kind of like you mentioned with that one gentleman, they get a little lazy. They decide they want to vacation somewhere outside of their mother country. And that's
bad
where
idea genes, as they say.
and that tends to be where we nab them. So what other tools does the Department of Justice have available to them to put some pressure on them? Are there any other places that they can come at them?
So there are really two things that can be done here. The first is try and attack the financial angle, usually through the Department of Treasury, and seize the money gained via ransomware attacks. So in this Justice Department announcement, they announced that from this alleged Russian perpetrator, they seized $6.1 million of assets allegedly gained through this ransomware attack and through other cyber crimes. That sounds well and good, and I think that is a very effective tool. You can track the financial transactions and, put a little the big hand of the U.S. government in some of these bank accounts and extract this money.
Right.
That's not always going to work. That might not be enough of a disincentive if you're in Russia, because let's say they catch only 50% of people they're able to seize the assets. That leaves, the rest of the 50% who are getting off scot-free after committing a ransomware attack.
And what if I grab 6 million of the 10 million that you've stolen? You're still doing pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
You're still making out like a bandit. That's not enough of a disincentive.
Right.
The other avenue is through diplomacy, and we've tried to do this. And quite frankly, I'm not exactly thrilled or excited about the prospects of some sort of new extradition treaty with Russia that specifically covers ransomware attacks, or some type of bilateral agreement where the Russian government would actually crack down on these malicious actors. We've now seen through 2 U.S. presidential administrations, the Russian government has been, under Vladimir Putin, has been quite resistant to going after cyber criminals.
Mm-hmm.
President Biden said in a recent virtual meeting with Vladimir Putin that the U.S. is taking ransomware attacks very seriously. We're going to go after your criminals. So it was kind of a shot across the bow. And, that so far has not brought Russia to the table to come up with some sort of agreement.
Yeah.
Until they start taking these attacks seriously, or until it becomes enough of a diplomatic concern, maybe because of sanctions that are imposed or other potential punishments, I don't see why they would, change their trajectory and not really doing anything about ransomware attacks.
Yeah, I mean, there was hope after the Colonial Pipeline incident, and where we sent some strong diplomatic signals that it was time to knock it off. And we saw some of these ransomware gangs say, we're closing shop, we're shutting down. And I think there was hope that maybe that was in response to that maybe they got the message from the powers that be in Russia to knock it off or at least lay low for a while. Seems now like they were just laying low for a while. We've seen some of these groups they'll go quiet and then they'll spin up again or they'll come back under a different name. I think to your point, don't get too optimistic that these folks are going away. I mean, what other things can diplomatically, do we threaten sanctions? What other things do we have to hold against Russia proper?
I mean, the more powerful the country, the less powerful our diplomatic tools are going to be. Sanctions is the most powerful one. You're not going to see. You can see, some offensive cyber operations against Russia potentially, although that, can have some second-order effects that aren't going to be great for the United States, and that would also be an escalation.
Right.
Otherwise, it's isolating them diplomatically and imposing sanctions. We have imposed sanctions on Russia for a variety of things. So far, at least as it relates to this particular issue, it doesn't seem to be enough of a disincentive. So I think because there's this lack of hope about diplomacy with the Russian government, we have to look at all of these other potential avenues, including seizing assets and broadening enforcement actions. So you have people on the ground in a bunch of different countries where we do have extradition treaties, working with law enforcement in those countries, and trying to catch cyber criminals who happen to cross into their jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. And they note in this article that we've actually had a good deal of success in doing that. We've made arrests in a number of countries recently. I mentioned Poland, but also in South Korea and a couple of other countries where we do have strong diplomatic relationships. Yeah. One of the intelligence analysts at a cybersecurity firm who was quoted in this said, we need, quote, a sustained cooperative law enforcement operation to make it more expensive to conduct ransomware attacks. That's what it's about. It's about scaring potential cyber criminals. As of right now, there are preliminary indications that at least as it relates to these particular cyber criminals, they've gone quiet. People who monitor these forums, who are scouring the dark web looking for activity from Revil and DarkSide and other bad actors, have noticed that they've gone dark. They'll probably, as you say, pop back up in different forms. But at least in the short term, that at least has some positive effect.
Yeah. It's I would love to be more optimistic about this, but it's hard to be given just what we see. It doesn't seem to be much stemming the tide. I guess it's I don't know, bailing water on the Titanic or something like that. I don't know.
We need a good Titanic metaphor for this. I mean, the real tragedy of it all is that these are relatively sophisticated actors, and the people they end up hurting are small businesses, mom and pop shops, people who rely on their local governments for services. Yeah. There was a ransomware attack that hit a police department in Fulton, New York. That's a small town. I've been there. My in-laws are from that area. They're not going to be particularly well equipped to deal with these types of attacks. Right. So it does have a real world impact, and it's good that the Justice Department is taking this seriously. I hope that there's some mechanism where in the long term we can hold these cyber criminals accountable. Yeah. I mean,
it's a good point too that it's the high dollar value ones that make headlines, but the ones that are I don't want to say nuisance attacks, but those ones targeting small businesses for smaller dollar amounts, those have continued. Those have not fallen off because it's easy pickings. It's low-hanging fruit for many of these operators. And so we don't hear about those, but they're still happening and extremely costly for those small and medium-sized businesses as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the difference in trying to rob, a bank in Midtown Manhattan versus trying to rob a exurban convenience store.
Right.
The winnings, the potential winnings are going to be different, but it is easier to attack those smaller entities that don't have the same kind of robust defenses.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we'll have a link to that story in the show notes, as always. My story this week, I'm linking to a story from Mashable. This is written by Jack Morse, but been a lot of coverage of this all over the place. This one's titled, Lawmakers Come for Facebook Algorithm with Filter Bubble Bill. So we have a bipartisan group of lawmakers. They have put forward a bill that they're calling the Filter Bubble Transparency Act.
Tragic lack of an acronym there. That's a missed opportunity.
That's right. It's the football.
Yeah, that does
right.
not come off the tongue well.
Not on their game here,
No.
these lawmakers. Yeah. And basically what this comes down to is you've got a group of lawmakers, like we said, a bipartisan group, who are putting forward legislation that would require the big social media companies to give users the option of having their interactions with these social media companies to happen in a non-algorithmic way. In other words, have the option to switch off the algorithmic ranking system that they use to put things in front of you. So, for example, Twitter already has what they refer to, I believe they call it a reverse chronological timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So basically you can see stuff as it happens rather than what Twitter thinks will be interesting to you.
It's crucial for live sporting events, by the way.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I don't want to hear about what happened an hour ago. I want an analysis of the last play.
Right, okay. I'll take your word for it. But, obviously this is targeting Facebook. Or should I say Meta?
Yeah.
It's targeting them because I think they're the poster child for this sort of algorithmic presentation of channeling information to people. So what they're trying to do here is just give users the option to throw a switch and not have that information fed to them in that way. Of course, for the providers, that's not a good thing because that's how they make their money,
Right.
is by putting things in front of you and being able to place ads in front of you based on things that you find interesting. What do you make of this, Ben? First of all, the fact that this is coming from a truly bipartisan group of legislators, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is
noteworthy,
interesting.
right?
Absolutely noteworthy. And it's, knowing these members of Congress, this is not a group of individuals that agree on much. We're talking about a couple of very conservative members and a couple of very liberal progressive members who put this bill together. This proposal is limited in a number of ways. The main way is that it only applies to the big guys. So any company that has 500 or fewer employees or possesses data on fewer than 1 million people will not be covered under this bill. But, I think that makes sense because the targets are the Facebook/Metas of the world and Twitter. I'm wondering how much opposition Facebook/Meta will put up in opposition to this. I mean, they've signaled a willingness to consider regulation when it comes to things like Section 230. Obviously, this would be a big hit to their business model. That's true.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is you're giving people an opt-out. How many people are going to miss the algorithmic content when it's gone? I sort of think, there are going to be some very privacy-conscious people, the type of people who disable location services on their phone, the type of people like our listeners and us who are cautious about this stuff. But then there are going to be other people who are like, you know what? I kind of miss seeing that targeted advertisement.
This is a lot less fun. This is right. This is like going out to dinner and not being able to have dessert.
Right.
Right.
I mean, we have become addicted to content that's very narrowly tailored to our interests and our buying habits. Have you ever tried to browse a website, where maybe you're using somebody else's computer, it doesn't have your cookies, and it just seems different? I think that's something that many users, despite what they say or how they would respond to an opinion poll, they might actually respond. They might actually not opt out of this service.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think, when you look at Twitter, who has something like this already
built in. I've seen many people say that when they switch over to the reverse chronological version, magically and mystically, it switches itself back over time.
Right.
You
always have to recheck that box.
Right, yeah. Right. And I would say based on Facebook's past history of whether or not they tend to operate in good faith when it comes to these sorts of things, I would expect the same from them, unless there was an actual rule here that would prohibit them from doing so.
Right.
But I think you're right. I think the thing that people like about Facebook, the itch that it scratches for people, part of that is the algorithmic stuff. So to turn it completely off, to have just an on-off switch, to not be able to dial it down or have any sort of granularity in dialing it in, I think you're right. A lot of people will try it out and they'll say, this is no fun, and they'll turn it back on, and that's that. But I guess for the folks who want it, it's good to have it, right?
Right. And that leaves us to the question of how likely is it that this bill will actually become law?
Yeah.
As you know, and I've said this many times, the likeliness of any proposed piece of legislation becoming law in our polarized and largely dysfunctional Congress is pretty low, even though this does have bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that is pretty ambitious, and with the lobbying power of Facebook/Meta, this seems to me like the type of thing that's going to get bottled up in committee. Get those Silicon Valley legislators in there saying, let's hold our horses a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I were a betting man, I would most likely say this does not stand a realistic chance of passing.
Yeah.
Now, that's just for the short term. In the long run, as Congress tries to take action to rein in these algorithms, this is the low-hanging fruit, because it would be voluntary. People would still have to opt out of it. So Facebook and Instagram and Twitter could still have algorithmic content, with most people, as we've said, maybe not opting out.
Right.
They can still make their money. One other reason that the tech companies might not be as resistant to something like this is if the federal government regulates the algorithmic content like this, that would preempt state action. So prevent companies like Facebook from having to deal with 50 separate state regimes trying to regulate algorithmic content. If you're going to do it, it's, from their perspective, it's just better to have one standard that comes from the federal government.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I've seen in some of the commentary on this is some folks, dare I say, pedantically poo-pooing the definition of algorithm.
Yes.
That these, these out-of-touch legislators don't know what algorithm means, and this is meaningless, and they're using the term improperly, and everything online's an algorithm, and I just I sigh ruefully and say, let's not miss the forest for the trees.
Right, exactly.
But some people can't help themselves.
Yeah, I mean, we know what the target of this legislation is,
right,
and we don't have to narrow down in a proper dictionary definition of algorithm to understand what these lawmakers are trying to do.
Yeah. Still, it gets my goat up.
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that would be a good opportunity for us to move on before my dander gets too.
Let's cut it out.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will have a link to all the stories in our show notes, of course, and we would love to hear from you. If you have something you would like us to cover, you can send us an email. It's caveat@thecyberwire.com.
This episode is brought to you by Palo Alto Networks, the leader in cybersecurity. As AI-driven attacks increase, organizations can't afford to have network security that's stuck in the past. Discover how Palo Alto Networks can help you predict what's coming and proactively secure against it with a zero-trust, AI-powered network security platform built to secure whatever, whenever, wherever. To learn more, visit paloaltonetworks.com/network security platform.
I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Jenny Lee. She is an attorney at Arendt Fox LLP, and we discussed the recent Facebook whistleblower testimony. Really interesting stuff. Here's my conversation with Jenny Lee.
One of the most striking aspects about the issues in Haugen's complaints to the SEC, speaking from the perspective as a lawyer, given my chosen field here, is what those issues reveal to be lacking about the U.S. legal system. At the end of the day, this was a significant public assertion about the practices of Facebook, and the protocols at the SEC are an indirect mechanism at a high level, if you think about it, to confront the concerns at hand, because the SEC regulates the problem in the society of investor harm, and they do not necessarily directly regulate harm on consumers or children or users of social media. And so at the heart of the SEC complaints are essentially what misrepresentations may allegedly have been made to investors. But what's missing in our US legal system right now is arguably a single federal regulator whose process or tip line can be triggered to help oversee corporate conduct that affects these issues of social media-based consumer protection, children's protection, or online content users.
Are there other federal agencies that could step in here? Would this be under their categories?
Absolutely. There's the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Federal Communications Commission. And, I think that the existence of this patchwork quilt of agencies is itself, emblematic of a larger issue in the legal system. There's this conflict between the pace at which tech is evolving versus how quickly we can update our laws. So right now at the federal level, these regulations apply to businesses in terms of the activity in question. And so that is why, any number of different agencies could potentially find a hook in some of the issues. It just depends on what you define to be the activity and issue.
Yeah, it strikes me that one of the issues here is that when it comes to something like social media, that's different than selling a product in a brick and mortar store. If I sell a dangerous product and a consumer gets harmed, a child gets hurt, or someone, people compare this a lot of times to big tobacco. If I have smokers who get, have health issues, well, that's pretty easy to draw a line between. But it seems like online organizations like Facebook, as you, I think, very well point out, it's a little bit more fuzzy there. It's harder to say who's directly responsible for regulating them.
Right. And I think one of the difficulties as attorneys and policymakers and other stakeholders might have seen thus far is that we're also trying to operate in this world where we have inherited legacy legal systems. So I fully agree with your point that these issues kind of ring true in the consumer protection realm. And I do think that there will be activities that occur, in the major players in DC on that front in terms of consumer protection. But there's also this other rule, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And that one is technically belonging to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. So it's almost like the online, economy of communication arguably also belongs in our federal, communications regulations. Really what Section 230 has done is, decades ago, initially allowed for there to be a safe harbor for tech companies. Back in the 90s, the world was a very different place, and many of these tech companies were much smaller, and pioneering technologies were being put forth. And the Congress at that time wanted in the CDA to allow the internet economy to flourish. And so that there was a need, according to the policy underlying that law, to allow there to be a safe harbor so that if you're running, say, a platform, whether that be social media or home improvement apps to find contractors, or, online reviews about hotels or whatever it is, that if you're running that platform, you are not to be liable for whatever other people publish on your platform. Similar to the idea that if you are a library, you're not liable for any offenses that are, kind of conveyed in the books that might be written by authors that place their books in the library. So at that time, it was this sort of incentive was, there were two parts to the CDA. And forgive me for getting pretty, I nerd out on these legal issues because I look at this stuff all day. It was two things. It was that the provider of the platform is not to be liable for the actions or statements of the third parties who go on that platform. And the second part was, and by the way, if there are some good reasons why the platform may want to regulate itself so that people aren't doing harmful or illegal things on their platform. So as long as the platform is operating in good faith and following their own internal rules that they've put together on how to regulate themselves, then they also are, sort of insulated from liability as well. And if you fast forward now from there to, 30 years later, we're in a very different world now. And a lot of these issues that were raised in the whistleblower testimony, but also are raised by others in Silicon Valley, like Tristan Harris, for example, these issues, whether they be harm to young girls or misinformation, or whether it be conservative voices that are being so-called sanctioned or censored, or whether it be, to my reference to Tristan's work and his team, this idea about the attention economy and like the downgrading of the human experience when people are addicted to screens or are kind of living in a prolonged state of conflict and antagonism or distraction, isolation, fake news, that as a society, that is a negative thing to be happening. So all of these issues, whatever the beef might be, I think really squarely collides with the Section 230 thing, because the Section 230 liability exemption is really what incentivizes all companies and, sort of establishes who's going to be accountable or what are the consequences of the actions of different people that use social media. And also, to the whistleblower's point, what are the consequences of creating or promoting or enhancing algorithms that put forward a specific intended effect.
Well, on the other side of this testimony, in your estimation, what are the methods that we have available to us that are likely to actually see meaningful change? Do we have tools? Can the regulators, turn the dials to put us in a better place here when it comes to, for example, Facebook?
What is interesting on the consumer protection front is that there's certainly there's this Section 5 of the FTC Act, which also exists in a similar form in Section 1031, 1036 of the Dodd-Frank Act. And that is a kind of this ban on any practice that is unfair, deceptive, or abusive. And you could take a page out of the playbook of the FTC and the CFPB, where the regulators have for a very long time identified specific conduct that seems unfair or abusive. And as long as they can assemble evidence, if you will, that they've met the legal elements of those claims, then they can declare a practice to be, a violation of that. It's called UDAP, Unfair, Deceptive, Abusive Acts and Practices. And there's been many, I think there's decades of precedent of the FTC using the UDAP authority to go after privacy issues.
Listeners of our show have heard me wonder repeatedly if we need to have some sort of equivalent of the FDA for algorithms online, to put companies, these social media companies, in the position of first having to demonstrate that their algorithms do no harm, in the same way that pharmaceuticals have to go through testing procedures. Admittedly, it's a bit of a pie in the sky idea of mine, but since you are an expert in this area, I thought I would run it by you and see an idea that has any merit whatsoever.
Well, I think that even the proposal, I believe, that was put forth after the hearings in Congress this spring by Facebook was one where, as between the three companies that testified, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, Facebook was the only one at that time that actually made a suggestion to set up a protocol for, this issue relating to the adequacy of their self-monitoring efforts. And I think there's a lot of merit to your idea in the sense that when we're still trying to understand the technology and we're still trying to define what we think the harm is, it is really great to not jump too fast to write rules that will not make sense or that will be antiquated in just a few months or years. So, what's really nice about your analogy with the FDA is that I understand that in the FDA, there are also panels of experts that will be, congregated and opine on different potential therapies and drug solutions. And in general, I think I hesitate whenever we're creating a new bureaucracy because I do think that it's much more elegant to be as efficient as possible. And that having myself been a former CFPB official and now working with the regulators and the government on a daily basis, there certainly are challenges that just government processes make things sometimes more slower in pace than what the private sector can accomplish. But with that with that caveat in mind, right? I mean, I do think it's great to have like a data-driven approach where we can try to, assign this work to a particular body. And maybe it's not an agency, but maybe it could be even a kind of like a quasi-public-private partnership, or maybe it's like a private agency first for self-regulation where the government has oversight on top of that, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I think it does make a lot of sense because right now there are so many different concerns from both, sides of the aisle. And, we're seeing in this political environment that these issues are creating some strange bedfellows, that it would be great if we could just first define what is bothering us and what we want the legislators to actually act upon in this kind of holistic, data-driven way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. It's hard to say what you want when you can't get people to agree on what the ideal outcome might be.
I certainly think there's low-hanging fruit. Like, for example, I recently learned about Ashton Kutcher's nonprofit and the work that their team is doing to combat online sex abuse or human trafficking. I mean, there's just some low-hanging fruit where I don't think we'll disagree that these are things that would need to be addressed. But the more nuanced issue that you raised about kind of the effects more specifically of algorithms and some of these things about, like who should decide which attractive photograph of a female celebrity should be taken down because young girls, I mean, I have a lot of young girls in my family and a daughter myself, and these issues are very important, but it's sort of like, how do you implement a solution to that concern, and who decides what the algorithm should do or say and what the thresholds would be? I mean, those issues are a lot more, I think, nuanced than some of the ones where we can just all agree are horrendous problems in society that need to be addressed right away.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you suppose a good place is to begin then? I mean, there are places where people are in agreement and places where there is wide disagreement. Where do you suppose a good place to start would be?
Well, I think it would be good to take that task in two parts. So probably the first part would be that at least we can make incremental progress on issues that are low-hanging fruit, things that most people would agree on, like online child sex abuse or human trafficking issues, or things that we can perceive are occurring on the internet that are already defined to be clearly illegal, if not criminal. And so we can at least try to prioritize those things to begin getting something done right away. The second part of it, I think, is just really we need to also get some input and feedback from the tech companies, and based upon their expertise, try to better understand what can be done with regard to these algorithms and identify the root of the issue. How much of this is due to the fact that maybe there's foreign language translation issues, given that these are global companies, versus that we can blame the algorithm itself. And I think until we understand the root cause of the issue and also define what is the issue we're trying to address, we're not going to really be able to do a good job of crafting a solution. But at least those are a couple of immediate steps where we can begin to make progress.
Ben, what do you think?
Really interesting conversation. She's super knowledgeable.
Yeah.
I was really interested, particularly when she talked about how we don't have a regulatory regime that makes enforcement against companies like Facebook easy. They're subject to regulation from a bunch of different federal agencies. And sometimes that kind of ends up shielding them because there are these jurisdictional disputes between the FTC and the SEC.
Right. They all say, not it.
Yeah, exactly. So it ends up not being, a very effective or valuable system for the consumers. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a weakness of our system. So I thought that aspect was really interesting. And it was a great interview.
Yeah. Our thanks to Jenny Lee for joining us. We do appreciate her taking the time. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. The Caveat Podcast is proudly produced in Maryland at the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our senior producer is Jennifer Iben. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpe. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.